blessing for me to be with you. It really has. I've thoroughly enjoyed being with you. For all of you involved in the music, thank you so much. It was just great music. Let's give the music guys a hand. They did a great job. I hope your workshop was as good as the one I went to. Of course, when I went to, had the title, Wouldn't Quit. The naked truth about sex, I think it is. But anyway, really great, and it's just my privilege to be with you. John and the others that I met with several weeks ago, wanted to talk on finishing well. I know you had one last year at this conference on that, but you know, we just can't stress these things too much. There are too many things that war against us finishing well. I look at men that are in their 80s. You know, there's kind of a danger. I'm 56 years old. We have a retirement mentality in this country, which quite frankly I think is faulted, it's flawed. But we seem to think once we reach a certain place in life that we put it on autopilot and kind of coast. And that's just not the way life works. And so, this talk I've entitled The ABCs of Finishing Well. Now, I've mentioned to you I'm a pilot. And when you're a pilot, there are many flights that you remember. Most flights are really kind of routine. In fact, they say that flying is really long periods of boredom interrupted by brief moments of sheer terror. That's certainly been my experience. I've been flying for 36 years. I've owned 9 airplanes. I have 2 right now. One's a Beach Bonanza, which is a single engine, 6-seat, pretty fast, nice airplane. The other I just bought this summer. It's a little 2-seat, 100 horsepower float plane that I keep down Lake Eufaula. And you know, I'm the only float plane on Lake Eufaula, so I really get some gawks and stares. And these people have stopped their boat in front of me. They don't know they're on my runway. I'm not moving until they move. So, but anyway, most flights are rather routine, but there are some flights that you remember. And the one I'm going to tell you about today took place about 20 years ago. It was December of '86. And I remember my daughter, Dan was maybe a couple of weeks from delivering Annie. In fact, I was out of town and would call home a couple times a day to see if I needed to come home. But that's how I remember the timing of it so well. It was a flight from Wichita, Kansas to Kansas City downtown in a Cessna 414, which is a twin-engine pressurized piston engine pressurized Cessna. And wintertime, nighttime flight, and took off from Wichita and climbed to 17,000 feet, leveled off. And I think there's no place that's more alone than a single pilot aircraft on a dark winter night. Now, if you're not a pilot, you don't know that feeling, but there are times when you'll call into the air traffic controller just to see if he's still there. I mean, seriously, you do. You say, hey, just checking in, because there's silence for 20 minutes on the radio. And, you know, you kind of wonder, am I still on radar? Do they still know I'm here? Because everything's dark out there. And it was one of those nights. And so it's a strange feeling to be alone like that. And in our lives, as men trying to walk with Christ, it's also dangerous to be alone, isn't it? We're vulnerable when we're alone. Well, in the Bible, David was a character that we talk a lot about, and we all know that David got in trouble, and it happened one spring when he was alone. 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 1 through 5 says, it happened in the spring at the time when kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. They destroyed the sons of Ammon and besieged Rabbah, but David stayed stayed at Jerusalem. Now, one of the dangers is we do things a certain way to get to a point of success, and one of the dangers is when we get to that point of success, we tend to quit doing things the way that we did. David became successful by leading his troops into battle, and then when he got successful, he sent the troops out and he stayed behind. If he'd gone out with troops, Bathsheba was not out there. She was on the rooftop back at home. Verse 2, now when evening came, David rose from his bed and walked around on the roof of the king's house, and from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful in appearance. So David sent and inquired about the woman, and one said, is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? You know, even his servants had some sense. They said, King, that is the wife of Uriah. Uriah was one of David's 30 mighty men. So Uriah worked for David. And David had sent Uriah out to battle, and so he's now checking out his wife. David sent messengers and took her, and when she came to him, he lay with her, and when she had purified herself from her uncleanness, she returned to her house, and the woman conceived, and she sent and told David and said, I am pregnant. Well, David had just had a great battle over the Ammonites, one of his enemies, and instead of being where he ought to be, out leading the troops in battle, he was back home, he was alone, and he was not accountable to anybody. You know, Genesis 2:18 says, it is not good that man should be alone, so God gave us a companion, a mate. Ecclesiastes 4:9-12 says, two are better than one because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow, but woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. Again, if two lie together, they are warm, but how can one be warm alone? Though man might prevail against one who is alone, two will withstand him. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. Proverbs 27:17, we're familiar with that. Iron sharpens iron, and one man sharpens another. You know, it's not in God's plan that we be Lone Ranger Christians. We just don't have the strength. We don't have the wisdom. We don't have the ability. He never intended that we should hack it alone. He intended us to be for us to be with people, particularly with like-minded men. And we will likely find ourselves in danger when we're alone, and many times we're in danger when we don't intentionally put ourselves in harm's way. Back in the late 80s, we bought, when I was in the wholesale business, we bought 15 companies in 15 years. And so one of these was out in L.A., and my brother made the deal, and he said, go out to L.A., sign the papers, take it over, and stay out there and run it for the first week just to get it going. So I went out there. Supposed to go out on Monday, come back on Thursday. And our attorney flew out there to paper up the deal. Our attorney's a young lady. And, well, the deal didn't happen on Monday. And it didn't happen on Tuesday, and it didn't happen on Wednesday, and finally on Thursday we got it done. So instead of her going out and back, she's out there with me for 4 days. Well, nothing happened. I didn't touch her. Neither of us did anything appropriate. We didn't say anything inappropriate. Neither of us did anything inappropriate. Neither of us said or did anything inappropriate. But at the end of 4 days, I was very uncomfortable. I got home, and my buddy across the street, he said, she was his attorney too, he said, how'd it go out there? I said, man, I tell you, I don't want to be in that situation. You know, if you are around a woman other than your wife very much, it's pretty difficult to stay away from just becoming more familiar than you ought to be in your conversation and so on and so forth. And he says, you know, if you ever run into a situation like that again, he said, call me and I'll go with you. You know? And I'll tell you, my wife has great antenna. That night we went to a dinner. And man, she was mad at me. What are you doing out there for 4 days with her? Honey, nothing happened. Well, I don't care. I don't want that to happen. And it hasn't. In fact, ironically, that was almost lady is still our attorney. But trips like that have not happened again, and I just told her, I said, you know what? I don't want to talk about personal things. You can't be a good friend with some woman other than your wife, guys. It will not work. Well, the A of finishing well is accountability. David was alone, he was not accountable. The ABCs of finishing well. A is accountability. B is build the basics beforehand. Back to this flight. 17,000 feet, dark winter night. Everything's going along fine, and somewhere near Emporia, Kansas, there was this loud bang. And what had happened, the seal had failed on the cabin door, and somehow the door blew off. And we were at 17,000 feet. There's not enough oxygen, particularly at night, over about 10,000 feet. And so we were depressurized immediately, and loud, cold, and I declared an emergency and told air traffic control I was descending. And all that's fine, except when I descended, I went to the clouds. And so now it's cold and loud, and it's icing conditions in the clouds. So I turned on my de-icing boots on this plane, and they didn't work. And I didn't know why. Then later I found out that the reason that the boots failed is it's like a pneumatic. It's a rubber boot on the leading edge of the wings, and it inflates and it cracks the ice and it blows off. Well, when the door fell off, it damaged the boot on the tail, and so all the air went out that place where it was damaged. But we were doing okay, and they had us descending, and then, while I was still descending, I had a fire on the left engine. That's when you wish you were in a B-52 and they say, you got a problem on engine number 4 and you go, which side? But in my plane, it was not number 4 on which side, it was the engine on the left side. Well, this plane's equipped with extinguishers, extinguisher bottles, and so you fire that off, it puts out the fire, and you've got the fuel, and shut down the engine, feather the prop, and you're doing okay. And so then we descended to 3,000 feet. But we have no pressurization, it's cold, it's dark, we're on one engine. The plane will still fly like that. And it's not what you wish, but it's what it's better than no engine. But you build the basics beforehand. And in aviation, if you don't practice these things beforehand, if you don't make sure all your equipment's working beforehand, then when it happens, there's not time to get the checklist out. For instance, they train you. In case of a fire, you train where your hands are supposed to go, because it's going to be dark and you can't see. I knew the guy who was the pilot on the OSU plane crash. Was Denver Mills, is that right? I had flown with him before. And I believe what happened that night, the co-pilot was not checked out on that aircraft. But I'm told that in that King Air, and people say, oh, that little airplane, a King Air 200 is a heck of a nice airplane, guys. It's a good airplane. But on that plane, I understand the pilot's instruments are electrically driven, the co-pilot's instruments are pneumatically driven by air. And I think they had it was a dark winter night, they were in instrument conditions, I think they had a catastrophic electrical failure. And Denver's instruments quit working. The co-pilots were still good, but I don't think the co-pilot knew that implicit systems on that plane enough to know that. If they'd have had some kind of a lighting system and could have gotten a hold of the plane before it got upside down, they would have been fine. But if you don't prepare ahead of time, you're in trouble in an airplane. Great example of prepare ahead preparing ahead of time is Daniel. Daniel, was a young Jewish boy. They took him to another country. He became one of the most powerful men in Babylon. In fact, he was one of the three men who were at the next level under the king. And some of the other commissioners and rulers got jealous of Daniel, and they determined, it says in Daniel 6, verse 3, it says, Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. So the king planned to make Daniel like the ruler over the entire kingdom, second only to the king. Well, they began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs, but they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. So they looked at Daniel and they said, we don't want him taking this powerful position, being over us, but they couldn't find any grounds on which to accuse him. Verse 5, then these men said, we will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God. So you've heard it, they cooked up a scheme where they went to the king, they said, King, oh, you're so good, why don't you make a decree that no one can offer a petition or a prayer to any God or any person other than you for 30 days. And if they do, they're thrown into the lion's den. So the king thought, well, that sounds pretty good, so he issued it. And they knew that Daniel had the practice of praying 3 times a day. He'd go into his upper room, he'd open the windows towards Jerusalem, and he'd pray 3 times a day. And they made it illegal to do that under the threat of death. So what did Daniel do? Daniel 6, verse 10. Now when Daniel knew that the document was signed, he entered his house. Now, in his roof chamber, he had windows open toward Jerusalem. And he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God as he had been doing previously. Daniel had a pattern in his life of time alone with God, prayer to God. It was so evident in his life that even his enemies knew it. And when a crisis came, Daniel kept doing what he did, even though that meant he might face death. Daniel's faith was visible. He didn't hide it from anybody. It was predictable. Even his enemies could predict what his behavior would be. And you know the story, how they came and arrested Daniel and they threw him in the lion's den, and God shut the mouths of the lions. And the next morning when the king went down there to check on him, he said, Daniel, are you all right? He was all right. The king pulled Daniel out, made him number 2 man in the whole kingdom, and threw his accusers into the lion's den, and the lions ate him. His faith was visible, predictable, and it was also believable. It says that the king decreed that the God of Daniel is the living God, enduring forever, and his kingdom shall never be destroyed. The king believed in God, not because of anything that happened in the king's life, it's because of what he'd seen in Daniel's life. He was believing it. You know, we were in Nashville last year doing a tour of their downtown, and we came across this huge hole in the ground downtown. And we said, what's going on there? And they were building a high-rise apartment building. And the first thing you do when you build a high-rise building, we have some, I'm sure, some structural engineers in here. But the first thing you do when you build a high-rise building is what? You dig a big old hole in the ground. Why? For the foundation. Because no structure can endure stresses that exceed the strength of its foundation, right? We just know that. So Jesus says, if you're going to build a house, count the cost beforehand, and you build that kind of foundation. Here's the problem we get into in our lives, guys. I enjoyed lunch with John. Is it Wogemuth? Did I say it right? Boogie Woogie or whatever. He's a young man. And we're his age. And We go to school, we get married, we start having a family, and then we're 30 years old, and then we're 35, and then we're 40, and then we're 50, and we get all these responsibilities if things work our way. And what we have is we have 50-year-old men walking around with 5-story buildings on 2-story foundations. You see what I'm saying? In other words, back when they were John's days, they didn't lay the foundation that would support the kind of demands and responsibilities and stresses that they're going to have 15, 20, 25 years later. And that's why men are 55 years old and leave their wife they've been married to for 35 years. And you go, what happened with him? He just twisted off. No, he didn't twist off. He just exceeded the capacity of his foundation. In a lifetime of putting stress on his life and stress on his marriage finally hit the straw that broke the camel's back, and his life failed, his marriage failed. It's because he laid an inadequate foundation back when he was John's age. Now, you may say, well, Kirk, I'm 45 years old, I'm not 24 anymore, and what am I going to do about it? Well, start where you are. You know, if you're 45 years old, you may live to 95 years old. So start where you are. I was talking to Gary Hine, and he said that John Crawford told him when he was 41 years old, he said, Gary, he says, what are you going to be in 4 years? He said, well, John, I'll be 45. He said, well, you want to be 45 without a college degree or 45 with a college degree? And he went to school and finished his degree in his 40s. It's good advice. The height of the structure cannot, in the long run, exceed the capacity of the foundation. Matthew 7, 24 through 27, Jesus said, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rains fell, and the floods came, and the wind blew and slammed against that house, and yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand, and the rains fell, the floods came, and the wind blew and slammed against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. Well, there's several key structural elements. One is walk by the Spirit. Galatians 5:16 says, but I say walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. Are you having trouble with sin? Well, then start walking in the Spirit instead of in the flesh. It makes a big difference in our, guys, we don't have the power to defeat sin and Satan. But God's Spirit does. So walk in the Spirit. Someone said, can you live a week without sin? No. Can you live a day without sin? I don't think so. Can you live an hour without sin? Maybe. Can you live a moment without sin? Sure. Okay. Then just walk in the Spirit moment by moment. Walk by the Spirit. Second, guard against sin. Psalm 119, 9 through 11. How can a young man keep his way pure? By guarding it according to thy word. I have laid up thy word in my heart, that I might not sin against thee. God's word guards against sin. Third, build a hedge around your thoughts. 2 Corinthians 10, 3 through 6. For though we live in the world, we're not carrying on a worldly war. For the weapons of our warfare are not worldly, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every proud obstacle to the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ. Take every thought captive to obey Christ. Being ready to punish every disobedience when your obedience is complete. So build a hedge around your thoughts. One of the best things, I read a book and it talked about two things. One is being tempted sexually. Look her in the eyes instead of somewhere else. And by the way, if you ever want to see a guy just look foolish, just go to the mall and watch men's eyes. And other people are watching your eyes too, guys. Look on their countenance, look them in the eye. And secondly, if you see something that you should not be looking at, then bounce your gaze. You know, instead of dwell on it, just bounce it. Build a hedge around your thoughts, and then spend time alone with God. Mark 1:35, speaking of Jesus, in the morning, a great while before day, he went out and departed to a lonely place, and there he prayed. And I don't know about you, but I do know about me. And those days when I spend time alone with God, it is much easier to walk in the Spirit. It just works that way. Build the basics beforehand. Bombing happened in Oklahoma City in 1995. The fellow who was the commander of the response, the emergency response, rescue response, this guy named Gary Mars, he was the police chief, fire chief at the time. Later on, he was my assistant in the mayor's office. He's the city councilman today. And people were amazed that Oklahoma City was able to respond to that emergency in such an organized way. Well, what had happened was that the previous fall, our entire city leadership, the mayor, city manager, the fire chief, the police chief, all the key department heads, public works, all went to a school in Pennsylvania put on by the federal government, FEMA, on disaster response. And so when the bombing happened, they knew what their role was because they had prepared for it and practiced it. And they knew who was in charge and what the lines of communication were. They knew what was the role of the federal responders, the state responders, the local responders, the people from out of state. Everyone knew what their assignment was. On 9/11, the day of 9/11, I received an invitation at the mayor's office in the mail from Mayor Giuliani, inviting me to a disaster response seminar at the World Trade Center. It's supposed to be about a month after that. And of course they didn't have it because the building was no longer there. But after that, I heard Mayor Giuliani speak at the Conference of Mayors, and he told about that they had practiced a terrorist attack. They practiced responding to a terrorist attack on the World Trade Center. Now, I don't think even the terrorists figured that the buildings would collapse because of the gasoline. But certainly our side had not anticipated that. But Giuliani said that the reason New York was able, and you know, they saved tens of thousands of people out of those towers before they came down because of their response. Now, several hundred firefighters lost their lives in that effort, but they saved over 20,000 people. Because on a whole bunch of Saturday mornings, they had done what they called tabletop exercises, and they had mobilized all these people to practice a disaster response. And one of those they practiced was the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center. And Giuliani said, you know, a lot of those Saturdays, I think, you know, I'd sure rather be at my kid's ball game. But they practiced. So, ABCs of finishing well: 1, accountability; 2, build the basics beforehand; and then 3rd, cut the cords of sin. Well, remember, I'm at 3,000 feet, dark winter night, door off, cold, engine on fire, engine out, de-icing system doesn't work. And so they vectored me to do an ILS into Emporia, Topeka, Forbes Field at Topeka. And they turned me over to approach control, and when you get low in the wintertime, when the storm system is around, it gets more and more turbulent. And so the further I went down, the rougher the air got. And they vectored me to intercept the localizer, and I did that, fighting that turbulence, and I did fine until they told me to switch to tower frequency. Now, normally on a flight, about 10 to 15 minutes out, you get everything set up, and you dial in all your frequencies, and you have them set where you can just push a button and it goes. But that night I had not done that, and so when I looked over to find the knob and switch to the tower frequency, I was fairly low at the time and lost just lost concentration on the glide slope and crashed about a mile short of the runway. Well, you know, it's that way in our lives. King Saul, I'll pick up on that later. King Saul, 1 Samuel 15, God told him, go out and utterly destroy the enemy. And Saul went out and he destroyed most of the enemy. But he didn't kill the king, and he didn't kill all the best of the spoils. Kind of kept the best for himself. And then Samuel was God's prophet, and he came to Saul and he said, did you obey what God said? And Saul said, oh yes, I obeyed what God said. And right then one of the sheep, I heard one of the sheep bang. And Samuel says, well, what's this that I hear? He says, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. You know, Saul says, oh, we kept some of those for a sacrifice for the Lord. And Samuel says, no, we want you to obey rather than give a sacrifice. And God's judgment was that because of his disobedience, Saul was removed as king. Well, the work of sin in our life is a process. If you look at James 1, 13 through 15, no one should say when he is tempted, I'm tempted by God. For God himself cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each man is tempted when he is, here's how sin takes place, when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. And desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. Sin is a process. It's not a sin to be tempted, but it becomes sin when we nurture it and think about it and coddle it and give occasion to it. And we find ourselves where David found himself in trouble. When God tells us something, he wants us to acknowledge it and then obey it. Father, I understand what you said. In all your ways acknowledge him. I understand what you said. And then he wants us to obey him completely. You know, Moses, in Numbers 20, God told him to speak to the rock. And he got mad at the people, and really just in a fit of anger, instead of speaking to the rock, he took his staff and he hit the rock twice. And because of that lack of explicit obedience, Moses did not get to go into the promised land. Water came out of the rock. Yeah, Moses did not obey God's command. You know, Jesus, when he was at the wedding at Cana of Galilee, and he turned the water into wine, what did his mother say to the men? He says, you do whatever he tells you to do. Yeah, I don't know what God's telling you to do. There's some things God tells to all of us. You know, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery. That's to all of us, no doubt about those things. But you know, I don't know what God's got his hand on your life to do. But he does, and I suspect you do. And whatever he tells you to do, you need to do it, and do it like he tells you to do it. I have a friend. Sin's a process. I have a friend that I grew up with. We went to church together. Went to Europe together when we were in school. We even lived in the same house. My grandmother's house is Norman. I lived in the basement. He lived on the second story in an apartment. He flunked out of OU when he was a senior. Now, you may think that's not very hard to do, flunk out of OU, but that's pretty hard to do when you're a senior, really. I found out later that he had started drinking in college and then started using marijuana. I didn't know it at the time. He got out of school, flunked out of school, and went to business. And as he went further into his business career, his use of drugs and alcohol became more and more frequent, to the point that it became on the way to work, during lunch, and after work, and into the evening, drugs and alcohol. And after about 15 years of this, a friend called me up one day and said, I'm concerned about Charlie. He told me last week he thinks he's an alcoholic and addicted to cocaine. So I called his parents. They lived out of state, and I told them that. They confronted him. About the same time, the feds confronted him and said, we know you're dealing cocaine, and you're going to get to live some years at our expense. And so this guy that was my good friend growing up went to federal prison for selling drugs. He didn't start out there, but he wound up there because sin is a process. And sin will take you further than you want to go and cost you more than you want to pay and keep you longer than you want to stay. And the Bible says that the cords of sin wrap themselves around us. It's almost like a spider web. You know, if I get one spider web around me, that's no big deal. 2, no big deal. 10, that's no big deal. But if you wrap those cords around enough times, sooner or later it gets more powerful than I can break. And so A is accountability, B is build the basics beforehand, and C is cut the cords of sin. You know, you see that in politics. Y'all remember Gary Hart running for president, odds-on favorite, get the Democratic nomination. He had a problem that he was with women he shouldn't have been with. And it bit him. Spiro Agnew was a small-time crook as mayor of Baltimore and as governor of Maryland. When he became vice president, he caught up with him. He resigned in disgrace. And for most of us, in the end, it's the little things that get us. It's anger, lust, maybe alcohol, maybe the way we handle money, maybe what we do on the internet or videos. Sometimes it's secret sin. It's things that you don't see as much. Things like greed or envy or bitterness or even a lack of balance. Maybe you're a workaholic and unbalanced in your life and the end it gets you. Sin is a process, and we need to figure out what those areas are and cut the cords of sin. Well, I survived the crash. I'm sitting in this wheat field near Emporia, Kansas, Topeka, Kansas. And that's a really miserable feeling. And then I started hearing all these switches flipping behind me. And the instructor said, you know, I've never had a student get that far on that flight before. Because you see, I wasn't in a Cessna 414 flying from Wichita to Kansas City. I was in a simulator that never left Wichita. And he flipped a few switches and put me right back up to 3,000 feet, and we shot it again. But you know, just like that instructor was able to flip a few switches and put me back up at altitude, God's that way. God is the God of the fresh start. 1 John 1:9 says, if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just and will forgive our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. He will cleanse us from how much unrighteousness? All. So, if you got sin, if you're feeling guilt about sin, and you've confessed it, then where's that guilt coming from? A little louder? It's coming from the enemy. That's the enemy condemning you. That's not from God. That's not from the Spirit. If you've confessed it, his promise is that you're totally clean. So what you need to do is walk in the Spirit, walk in that new start. You know, nobody needed a fresh start more than David did. You know, David and Peter are just great encouragement, great source of encouragement to me, because I've not messed up as bad as they did, generally, and particularly David. Psalm 51 is David's chapter of confession to God. In Psalm 51:6, he says, behold, you desire truth in the inward being, therefore teach me wisdom in my secret heart. And then in verse 10, create in me a clean heart, O God, and put a new and right spirit within me. So God is the God of the fresh start. I don't know where you are today, but if you're like me, then every now and then you need a fresh start. Maybe today is one of those days. Well, in conclusion, are you accountable? It's very dangerous to be alone. You know, find a friend that you can call from time to time. Find a friend that will check you out and ask you the questions that need to be asked. When you're out of town on a business trip or just on a regular basis, how's your relationship with your wife, things of that nature. Are you about building the basics in your life? Are you having time alone with God? Are you memorizing Scripture? Are you equipping yourself with the weapons of the warfare that God gives us with which to fight the enemy? Are you building the basics? And then third, are you cutting the cords of sin? Has God brought any sin to your mind while we talk? He has mine. Has He brought any sin to your mind that you need to confess, turn over to Him, and live in His strength instead of yours? The ABCs of finishing well. Guys, I hope this time together has been profitable to you. I've certainly enjoyed being with you. Now, I would encourage you, even before we get up and leave, just ask God to give you one thing from this weekend that you can implement in your life. Because I'll tell you what's going to happen when you walk out the door. You're going to get in your car, you're going to head home, and all the normal stuff's going to hit you, and more demands than you can possibly satisfy. And if you don't watch it, you'll forget the things that have been said and things that God has impressed upon you this weekend. So I encourage you, just in the few minutes we have left, jot down one thing or two things that God has put on your heart that you can implement in your life. It's been my great pleasure to be with you. Thank you. Pastor?